I didn't turn it on for a reason. Thank you. That's another good reason. Considering this is the Rules Committee in the room, and I have spent many, many years up here, 1 month, as a member of the Rules Committee, I'm sure the discussion we're going to have today is a heck of a lot better than what it used to be. So I appreciate the three of you being here. What we'll do is votes will be anywhere after 2:45. We usually run late with that, so I hope we can get through I'm sure we can get through all of this before votes take place, which is another reason why we also tried to get his close to the floor here as possible so you can get back easily. So I want to introduce the three witnesses, the three speakers that we were going to be discussing here. Heather Gerken, for example, is the dean and a professor at Yale Law School. Used to be a clerk with Judge Souter, and also was working very heavily on the Obama campaigns, both 2008 and 2012, and has written specifically about things in what is now the founder of the National School of Federalism. Good title with that. I appreciate you being here. We also have Timothy Conlon, who's a professor at George Mason University. You got your PhD at Harvard. Before that, you also had some background with this. You were serving on the, what was it used to be called? The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which is what used to be here until the Gingrich-Clinton era, and then it went away. And one of the things we might want to consider again, so your experience with that is going to be very helpful, as well as also having been an assistant staff director, which I think is important with an Intergovernmental Relations subcommittee, but you were on the Senate side. So we'll have to forgive you for that indiscretion. Despite that, we're happy to have you here. Matthew Spalding, who I think we've met frequently. You are now vice president and dean of educational programs, right, at Hillsdale College. Has also got your PhD at Claremont. My brother got his PhD also. He's written extensively on this issue and used to be at Heritage. We've had a chance of talking about this topic with you and having your conversations at many times. So I appreciate all of you here. You have a different perspective, but it's going to be a perspective that we want to hear about. The purpose of this one, obviously, is we're not delving into specifics. We're still trying to talk about the basic philosophy of what we're looking and how this issue of federalism is really, it transcends lines. It transcends philosophical lines. It transcends political lines. And I think this could be very helpful. So if we could start with you, Ms. Gerken, then Mr. Conlon, and then Mr. Spalding. We don't have a timer here for you. Roughly 5 minutes for an opening, and then we'll ask questions. But once again, we're not going to do opening statements. What we'll do is just open it up for questions for anyone afterwards and try and make this as less formal than usual in these situations, even though this looks awfully formal. So, Ms. Gerken, thank you for being here. Please.
Thank you for having me, Chairman Bishop and members of the task force. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about federalism. I've been working on federalism issues since 2003, and my work is united by a very simple aim, which is to show that federalism is for everyone. That question that frames this hearing is whether federalism is, in a sense, becoming federalized. And if you answer that question, as Chairman Bishop noted, you have to actually think about what federalism is in the 21st century. Now, traditionally, those who have studied federalism have divided into two camps. The pro-federalism camp emphasizes the importance of state power, distinct regulatory spheres, and the ability of states to regulate free from federal interference. And the other side are the nationalists, although given that nationalism has been used quite differently lately, let me just emphasize that their focus is a New Deal nationalist type. They are focused on national power, national norms, and national democracy. They are often skeptical of state power, and they cast federal government as liberty's protector. Neither camp has it right. Our federalism is not our father's federalism, and yet we continue to war over these outdated understandings. Today's federalism does not match either camp's dreams, nor does it resemble either camp's nightmares. Instead, today's federalism represents a middle ground between the two camps. So in order to understand what these camps get wrong, it's helpful to examine their understanding of state-federal relations. Members of the federalism camp think that government power involves presiding over one's own empire, regulating free from federal interference, and their aim is to increase the power that states wield. The nationalists actually have the same conception of power, but they prefer that the federal government holds sway. The trouble for both camps is that state-federal relations, as you know, looks nothing like the picture that I've just described. Instead, as I've written elsewhere, the states and federal government govern shoulder to shoulder, sometimes leaning on one another and sometimes jostling each other. When one moves, the other moves with it. If you recognize that state-federal relations are marked by political and regulatory integration and a high level of interdependence, then you'll see that today's federalism is quite different from the state of affairs that either camp envisions. Put differently, neither the state nor the federal government presides over its own empire. Now, if you care about state power, the states are still powerful, but their power does not depend on rigid jurisdictional boundaries or idyllic conceptions of sovereignty. Instead, today's federalism is largely sheared of sovereignty. Despite the best efforts of the Rehnquist and Roberts Court, if the federal government wants to regulate these days, it can. For every rule that the Supreme Court has devised to protect state autonomy, there is an easy workaround. That's why state power has as much to do with politics as law. States are powerful because the federal government needs states to get things done. The federal government's heavy dependence on states to implement federal program means that states are not shielded from national policy, but they also play a crucial role in shaping national policy. You need to look no further than immigration, marijuana regulation, and healthcare to see the evidence. Meanwhile, if you are a nationalist, today's federalism is also different from the scenarios that they have lauded and feared. Nationalists have long worried about a system where states are shielded from national norms or national regulations, and with good reason. You need only consult this country's ugly history during the civil rights movement to understand why. In today's federalism, however, states and localities are not shielded from national or norms, but they do play a role in constructing national norms. Just think, for example, about what happened with the same-sex marriage movement. Change began in San Francisco and Massachusetts, not in Washington, and it spread from state to state before reaching a national policy-making circle. So nationalists were right to recognize that national politics can protect racial minorities and dissenters, but they failed to realize that those policies are often born and invigorated at the local level. What we see today, then, is a federalism that neither camp imagined. Today's federalism does not shield states from national norms, but instead employs states in the construction of national norms. State power does not depend on clearly demarcated lines of power or autonomy, but on mutual dependence. States are still important, but in the way they are important is unexpected. Their strength comes from their status as agents, not principals, as servants, not sovereigns. So once we recognize the crucial difference between real-world federalism and the federalism described by many academics, the debate changes. It becomes possible to be a nationalist who believes in federalism. It becomes possible to be a progressive who favors federalism. On this view, the national government should have the power to exercise what I call the national supremacy trump card when it matters. But federalism also plays a crucial role in fostering debate and promoting change. Devolution, in short, can serve nationalist ends. And if I may speak to my brethren in the federalism camp, in today's federalism, state power does not depend on court-crafted conceptions of sovereignty, which often trade on blurry, hard-to-defend lines. Instead, state power depends on smart politicking, savvy negotiation, and strategic implementation. States exert control from within the national scheme, not apart from it. And while the states can't block the federal government from invading their turf, they are also licensed to invade the federal terrain. That is all to say, Chairman Bishop and members of the task force, that today's federalism supplies grounds for compromise and agreement between these two long-warring camps. We should all, Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, recognize the importance and value of state power. Federalism does not have a political valence. The mutual dependence between states and the federal government is integral to producing debate, compromise, and dialogue, and all of those things are necessary to support a well-functioning democracy. And that, of course, is what federalism's aim should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop and members of the task force. Well, as panelists, we were asked to provide a bit of a primer on the nature of federalism and intergovernmental relations, so I'm going to be a little more pedantic and a little less interesting than my colleague here to begin with. But I think it helps to recognize that, federalism is really the most original and important contribution that our founders made to the art and science of government. It's been widely copied around the world. And you know, throughout our history, there's been, you know, differences of opinion about what exactly federalism entailed. The framers of the Constitution had their own disagreements. I think with the advantage of history, we have a clearer definition, and we can think of federalism as a system of government in which power is divided between two or more levels of government, each with a significant degree of authority and heightened legal protection in the system, and each accountable to and capable of interacting directly with the people. That's distinct from intergovernmental relations, which is related, but you have intergovernmental relations in any system of government. We have a particularly complex system of intergovernmental relations because we have 50 states, over 90,000 local governments, Indian tribes, territories, hundreds of grant and aid programs from the feds to the states, from the states to locals, giving us a very complex system of intergovernmental relations. Now, our federalism system has changed fairly significantly over time, I think we're all aware, for a variety of reasons. Some have been economic and technological changes that have altered the meaning of state boundaries in important ways in a global and nationalized economy. Political changes as well that have been referred to, particularly changes in our party system. When parties were grounded at the state and local levels and played the major role in, say, nominating candidates for Congress, they had tremendous informal political power in the system. That's changed. We have a more nationalized political system today. And of course, we've altered the Constitution from the original design as well, through formal amendments that have generally expanded the reach and power of the federal government. Now, it's common to think of these changes as a series of stages, beginning with a period of dual federalism where there was a clear differentiation of the roles of the states and the national government, very little overlap. Each level had its assigned responsibilities and was deemed, as Justice Marshall said, supreme within its sphere. That's sort of dual federal layer cake model, fairly characterized legal theory at the time, but it really oversimplified reality on the ground, not just in today's federalism, but historically. There was, in fact, a great deal of cooperation and intergovernmental interaction throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, apparent in things like the great federal land grants for land grant colleges, agricultural research grants for highways, infrastructure, forestry, vocational education, all sorts of pre-New Deal types of intergovernmental arrangements. But scholars began to talk about a new stage of federalism following the 1930s and the New Deal because there was such an expansion of the federal government's role and number of programs. And they began to talk about cooperative federalism, a more pragmatic system in which all levels of government work together in a collective enterprise of problem solving, the sort of marble cake model as it's often referred to. And then finally, in more recent years, certainly since the 1960s and 70s, some scholars have begun to characterize our system as a form of coercive federalism because of the increase in various instruments of federal regulation, mandates, new forms of grant conditions that in some cases has overwhelmed the cooperative dimensions of the intergovernmental partnership. Although we continue to have a system with a great deal of cooperation across multiple fields, education, public health, transportation, and so forth. But there's no question that our current federal system is very much a complicated mixture of cooperation, conflict, complexity, confusion oftentimes. And we see that in fields like Homeland Security, an area that got tremendous levels of new attention in the post-9/11 world. By one count, we had something like 21 separate federal programs to assist first responders in homeland security. And other examples of that complexity are apparent across the grant and aid system. So in thinking about possible reforms or policy responses to this contemporary complexity, one approach is structural. It's focused on trying to reduce the federal government's role in certain areas, to increase it in areas of national priority, try to eliminate or consolidate a variety of federal programs. Hopefully, this school views the outcome as being a clearer separation of responsibilities between the different levels of government. The difficulty in achieving this is in part that every program has its supporters and clientele, and often strong intellectual arguments for doing what the program is intended to do. The devil is always in the details. So an alternative approach, and one that Chairman Bishop alluded to, is to build on the model of intergovernmental consultation that the Speaker's task force represents. Most federal systems have an institutionalized system of intergovernmental consultation. Traditionally, we've had that in the U.S. as well, particularly in the post-1950s era. But many of those institutions have been allowed to wither away, including the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. You know, I would strongly recommend giving some thought to resuscitating something like the ACIR. It actually could be done without new legislation, just through reappropriating funds with a membership composed of cabinet officials, members of Congress, governors, mayors, other local officials. It has a track record of not only allowing public officials to work through common problems in a productive manner, but many of the most significant reforms that we've had in our federal system originated with the ACIR in the past, from block grants to the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to property tax circuit breakers at the local level as well. So my humble recommendation is to give some thought to ways in which to institutionalize the forms of consultation that the task force represents. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, and thank all of you for your time on this topic. In my testimony, I discussed the foundations of federalism under the rule of law and the development of lawmaking in America based on popular consent. The principle of consent results in a particular constitutional structure in which power is vested in branches of government that are separate and distinct, yielding the concept of the separation of powers. Federalism should be understood in that context. Whereas the separation of powers and checks and balances might be considered a horizontal limitation on government across the government's institutions, executive, legislative, judicial, federalism created a tension between the national and state governments, a vertical separation of powers, if you will, that would keep national power in check as states seek to assert their own authority. I also address in my paper the misnomer that states have rights, it's already been talked about. No government, in short, federal, state, county, or local dog catcher actually possess any rights at all. Persons are endowed with unalienable rights. Governments merely possess powers, which in legitimate governments are derived from the consent of the governed. This is implicit in the Constitution and stated explicitly in the 10th Amendment. But the most fundamental change in America's form of rule is the rise of bureaucratic centralization, which I lay out in my paper in some detail. While the progressive movement provided the intellectual foundation for this transformation, the Great Depression and the New Deal provided the economic and political impetus to see it through. But the more significant shift occurred more recently under the administrative centralization of the Great Society and its progeny, Democratic and Republican. In its current phase, everything from financial restructuring to environmental regulation to healthcare reform must be dealt with comprehensively, meaning centrally, uniformly, systematically by a national administrative apparatus. The The actual decisions of lawmaking and public policy, decisions previously the constitutional authority of elected legislators like yourselves, are delegated to bureaucrats whose rules, there is no doubt, have the full force and effect of law. The modern president acts by discretion, creative interpretation, and executive orders more than legislative direction. Today's federalism augments the all but unquestioned supremacy of the national government in almost every aspect of our life. While retaining governing authority over a host of issues within their borders, modern federalism looks to the states for the administration of government policy emanating from Washington, with billions of dollars flowing back and forth from Washington to each state. Nowadays, states themselves are just as often as guilty of expanding and imposing bureaucratic rule as the federal government. Federal overreach has gone hand in hand with state overreach. Instead, the general pattern for some time has not been state resistance to federal activity, but a demand for more. Federal regulatory policies and transfer programs dampen state competition, create a virtual cartel among states that in turn lobby for more regulation and more programs as long as they agree with the regulatory scheme and control the dispersal of the benefits. Bureaucratic centralization contributes to decreasing democratic engagement and growing cynicism about our political system. It has increased the stakes of partisan politics and results in cronyism that undermines both liberal and conservative policies. In this context, the question is not simply the balance between the federal government and the state governments. Why advocate devolution if it merely means shifting power from a distant bureaucratic government to a closer administrative bureaucracy? The proper question, it seems to me, is what kind of federalism we want. I suggest a return for guidance to the Constitution and its greatest advocate, James Madison. Madison always referred to a compound republic, organized such that federal powers are limited and enumerated, strong, national in operation. Tocqueville meant something about similar to this when he spoke of centralized government, but decentralized administration. The governing system we should favor is Madisonian federalism. Strong but limited federal powers, national in operation, but they do not prevent states from properly administering their own policies that differ region to region, state to state, locality to locality. While there will certainly be disagreements, I would suggest that members of both parties could benefit from looking to the unique advantages offered by our system of federalism. Federalism allows many complicated policies to be broken down into smaller parts, some of which are better managed at the state and local level. And where bureaucratic centralization leads primarily to backroom deals and partisan cronyism, federalism allows for innovation and experimentation. Laboratories of democracy being an old phrase of Louis Brandeis of FDR fame and Supreme Court Justice. Experimentation well-suited to the needs of local communities and well-suited to uncover the better policy solutions that naturally result from state competition. But in the end, the objective, your objective, must be to strengthen our governing system, still partly federal and partly national, in order to revive and restore American democracy and self-government. Thank you.
I appreciate the presentations that are there. Once again, I want to facilitate questions, not just grilling, but also kind of back and forth in the interaction with that. Let's just go in the order of which you showed up and see if there's anything you want to say or talk about. So I'll start with Mr. Palmer, then Norma, you're next. So Gary, then Norma, then I think John came in. I'm lost.
Jennifer.
Were you last? All right, Jennifer, then. Good. Y'all know your place and rank in society now. Good. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each one of you for coming and testifying, and really enlightening to listen to all of you, and particularly the different views on what federalism means. I come from a perspective that federalism has to be defined and framed by the Constitution, and not by a modern view of federal and state relationships. With all due respect to Dean Gerken, it sounded more like a European arrangement than it did a constitutional arrangement under our Constitution. And Dr. Spalding, I appreciate your perspective on it, in particular reminding us of the separation of powers. I think we forget that both at the horizontal level and the vertical level. thing that I want to emphasize here is that, and I talk about this all the time, is that we have lost sight of constitutional government. You can have the rule of law without a constitution, but what we've lost sight of here is constitutional government, and that our federal government is the creation of the states. You look at the Constitution, the last article is the ratification. It was ratified unanimously, and I don't think that it was limited to the 13 states, original states, or the 9. It only took 9 to ratify. I think it applies to all 50. And Dr. Spaulding, I'd like for you to respond in the context of where we are and where we've been the last few years in respecting the fact that the power's not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution or prohibited to it or prohibited to the states that are reserved to the people, how that has come basically overlooked or ignored. I don't remember us ever repealing the 10th Amendment, so could you respond to that?
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Reminding us of the Constitution, the separation of powers, I think is the most important point, which is why I took the broader perspective of doing that, but then outlining its opposite, which we have today, which I've called bureaucratic centralization. We live under a new form of government. Both these forms exist, and one is clearly dominant. The other exists on paper and in Federalist Papers and here and there. But the other clearly is calling the shots, and the states are working in that world. There are prudential decisions that can be made. Federalism can play that role as well. But I think it's very important in this kind of conversation to back up and look at it more broadly. We have a very unique system of constitutional government. We don't have one. We have 51 constitutions. And they all operate in ways in which, for practical reasons, which you pointed out, you are unique to how it was developed in the constitutional system. That does serve a purpose. And here I would point out that we should look to that purpose not as a unique historical vestige of the past, but perhaps a solution, which is precisely it's the separation of powers, which encourages politics, which might be part of the help here. I think one of the reasons why more people on the left are interested in federalism today is precisely because, due to something like the separation of powers, they're trying to stir up a check against an executive that they don't agree with. So I think in that context, going back to those things actually might be and allude to what I like to call the Madisonian solution, which would help us solve a lot of our problems today.
Are we doing this the way we normally do a hearing? Where I've got a couple more minutes, or are we just going to go one to the other?
No, just go ahead, let's try and keep within a roughly 5-minute time frame.
It'll be less.
But yeah, let's do that. Jerry, do you want to, you're fine where you are, actually. Do you want to be up at the table?
I don't think there's a ramp, so I think
You're not going to be there, but you're just joining up at that table with them? Please.
I'll testify.
Yeah, we'll question you like everybody else.
Jerry, I said you could sit at the table, not speak at the table. So, Jerry, you're still up.
Rob was with me when I had the accent, so he understands.
Well, my last question again, and Mr. Conlon and Dr. Spaulding, you both respond to this, and you said something there in your testimony about comprehensive. When you lose this delegation of authority down to the state and local level, you lose a couple of things. One, as Jefferson said, the government that governs best, the closest to the people governs best. I think you lose that. But you also lose diversity. And I know a lot of liberals, progressives, they have a different definition of diversity, but in the context that I'm talking about, it's different ideas of how to get things done, the more efficient, more effective means of doing things. And that's what you see at local government. That's why so many people who've served in elective office say the best office to serve in is mayor. So when you have an overreaching federal government, central government, dictating down to the lowest level, you lose that diversity. You lose that opportunity for innovation. The very things that de Tocqueville identified, the voluntary associations and how people organize themselves. So would the two of you like to respond to that? I yield back.
Look, I think that the problem here, I think, is just overwhelmingly massive. The size, the amount, the number of programs, the centralization of them, the sheer magnitude, at the very least, has a crowding out effect of everything else below it. It's hard now to construct an independent state program, and hard for a state, in turn, to allow an independent local program to figure out a best policy solution. And yet there are all sorts of things in front of us, some of which the left would like and some of which the right would like, whether it's healthcare or endangered species or banking. There are a million ways in which restoring federalism would actually be to the political benefit of different parties. We have a constitution constructed for the purpose, which is why I wanted to emphasize consent, for the purpose of setting up a framework by which we can allow for self-government as much as is humanly possible, recognizing that we have to have core rights and fundamentals established nationwide, which is why we have a supremacy clause, but otherwise, in national security and certain national questions, but otherwise allowing as much as possible room for diversity of policies underneath that as much as we can. If that means some states go farther leftward and some states become more conservative and some states become much more independent, so be it. That's the beauty of federalism. And then you have a competition and see who's doing better.
Let me just throw this in, and then you can both respond to that. Article 4 guarantees to all the states a Republican, with a little r, Republican form of government. If federalism, the modern or progressive view of federalism, reduces those people to just agents of the federal government, does that basically make the Fourth Amendment irrelevant?
I never quite thought of that. That's an interesting question. But the purpose of the federal government, your view of federalism should be to preserve as much as possible Republican government at the state level, which means allowing them to self-govern as much as they can, having accepted those core national principles and duties in the federal government under the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this meeting again. Having served, having been a local city council member, a local mayor, elected mayor, not rotating mayor, a local state house representative, a state senator, and now in the House of Representatives, I have a pretty good view, bird's eye view. And I think that there is a place for all of those pieces of the puzzle that make our great nation. The federal government has a purpose, a bigger purpose, the need for emergency response, and its responsibility to ensure that our national, our homeland is taken care of and is secure. Highways that bring together the state's commerce. So there's a bigger purpose. And while small cities, I represented a city of 173,000 residents, depend on some basic principles to come from the state and the federal government. And resources, basic resources. We can't generate every single thing in our, small cities. But having said that, California is light years away from, some other states. Certainly, some of our cities within California and counties are light years away from some of our other counties and cities within the state of California. We're very diverse. Chickens and roosters running loose in the street is okay for one of my cities. Chickens and roosters running in the street is not okay for downtown Los Angeles. So when we look at our tax system, for example, and we look at marijuana, medicinal or recreational, when we look at health care, and California embraced the Affordable Care Act and created a very good program that has worked for California. When we look at all of these issues, it's working for us. We've somehow made it work, even though we might have not agreed with everything the federal government was tossing down. Here we have immigration systems where California, some parts of California have chosen to be more protective of people that have made California their home. So at which point does this bureaucracy become unwelcoming to the state of California? And when we look at environmental issues and we are so far ahead, but yet we don't control which way the wind blows. We don't control, what other states and how they pollute their water and pollute their air, or other nations for that matter. But yet we're leaders in that, and we want to be involved, not just nationally involved, but globally involved. We're the 5th largest global economy in the world. We're not going to take second place to another smaller state. So where do you see, as experts in some of these fields, where do you see a state of California being represented in this bigger bureaucracy?
Sure, I'd be delighted to speak to it. So you're describing a world of enormous complexity, and one that our framers did not anticipate, although they did provide for through something called the Commerce Clause, which allows the federal government to regulate wherever interstate commerce is involved, which is almost everything these days. What happens in our current system is that California plays an enormously important role. I call it a super state, because because by virtue of its size and power, it wields enormous authority across its lines and globally as well. That's a well-working system. It allows for a vibrant state and local government while still recognizing the importance of the national government. And the one thing I should emphasize is that much of California's power comes from being part of a national regulatory system. The reason why California effectively sets the rules for emissions in this country, it affects, even Detroit, is because it is part of a national regulatory system. The reason why the
But that
immigration...
is the floor for us.
That is right. No, exactly. And it's by virtue of the fact that you are participating in that system that you're able to wield such power. So the system that we have now is not one where the states and localities are being overwhelmed, just the contrary. But the difference is that they are powerful within a national integrated scheme, not separate sovereigns that that we might have once imagined. And that's important. It's important to remember that most of the places where the states are playing the most important and powerful role is as part of a national scheme. That's perfectly natural to expect in a democracy and economy that is complex as our own. The key, though, is that they still have an important role. If you want to ask if the states still have an important role, let's talk about marijuana enforcement. People sometimes think that Washington and Colorado nullified federal law. They didn't nullify federal law. Federal law still forbids marijuana. But because the federal government depends so heavily on them for enforcing marijuana enforcement, they actually, within their own states, are able to change the way things work on the ground. Think about immigration, sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. If President Trump wants to enforce his immigration policy, he is going to need to have the cooperation of states and localities on the other side. When President Obama wanted to pass health care, he needed the cooperation of red states as well as blue. So in the current system, you have one which actually encourages democratic compromise, even when the president doesn't need to consult with people in Washington.
But yet,
he will need to consult
we're
with
still
those
dependent
below.
on that compromise, or we need that stability in order to continue to be this growing global economy that is a donor state to the State of the Union, right?
Right.
So,
If you want a modern economy, you need a modern federal government.
thank you.
I know we're short on time, but I do want to point out that it is been upheld repeatedly by the Supreme Court that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution of the federal government are few and defined, and those that are reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite, and that the Congress cannot go beyond the authority assigned to us under the Constitution. A good way, I think, to think about it, Mr. Chairman, that's always worked well for me, is to think when if you think of the water in this glass as all the rights, powers, and privileges given to each one of us as individuals by the hand of God, and this first one is we the people, that when the state of Utah, for example, was formed, or California, the people of Utah only gave that much authority to the government of the state of Utah, and then when Utah became a state in the Union under the Constitution's delegation of authority, we only gave the federal government about that much authority and reserved all the remainder to ourselves. That's been repeatedly upheld by the Supreme Court. That was the view of the founders. Mr. Walker's exactly right about this, and it's not something that's really subject to debate. But when Congress attempts to regulate outside of its authority, it's just, now the Commerce Clause can be construed very broadly. We've got so limited time. I know we're voting in the last 5 minutes. Mr. Chairman, I just appreciate so much you having this hearing, putting this together. This is really one of the fundamental questions all of us face as members of Congress is what can we do to ensure that the separation of powers, the separation of authority between the state and federal government and the separation of authority between the branches of government is preserved. Congress can be very coercive. If we, in the Obama case, for example, Obamacare case, the Supreme Court said it's a tax, therefore Congress's authority is almost infinite. When it comes to sanctuary cities, for example, in repeated examples, the Supreme Court has upheld the ability of Congress to put reasonable limits on the receipt of federal money, as long as we recognize the states are absolutely sovereign and have authority that's reserved to them by the Constitution. Terribly abbreviated, Mr. Chairman. I just appreciate you doing this. We've got to get downstairs and vote, I think.
They just called for votes. Let me keep going, see how far we can get. Let's go like 7 minutes, and then we'll see what happens from there. Someday we'll get this done without being screwed over. Oh, by the way, you were wrong. When Utah was made a state, you kept all my land, so you screwed us over. So it doesn't count at all. Give it back, damn it. Jennifer?
Experts to see what's going on in terms of states and the federal government itself. So I was pleased when the speaker actually created this task force to see how those relations between the state governments and the federal government can interact. But more than that, a task for this committee on how to improve those relations and how to make things happen. I know this is going to be an issue for years to come. But having people that are experts in this area, it's really helpful for the committee, and I do understand for the rest of the House. This committee got 5 points that are the tasks that we are dealing with. How do we improve those relations? How do we examine the burden among the states and the federal government? And I know Professor, that you said that if you got the opportunity to design a new way to interconnect the state and the federal government, you will design a kind of consultation process between the states and the federal government. Is that right?
Yeah, having that kind of process established, I think, has proven to be very helpful.
What factors should be included there, specifically?
Well, I think a key issue is having all the key players at the table, right? I think what the Eisenhower administration got right when it created the ACIR was to have senior federal officials with leading elected officials from the state and local levels, so they weren't bureaucrats. This was, elected decision makers. With a small but capable staff to help them make do the necessary research and make some real progress on particular sticking points, which changed over time as the issues changed, areas of conflict and so forth between the levels of government.
I know that during the years, some states or towns or local authorities got a lot of innovation, and that the way we see states and the power of the federal government has been changing across the years. And that will continue to happen. How this task force, how this committee can help improve to have, the power which they reside in the states. I do believe that the states are the first, as Norma just said. I mean, I was Speaker of the House. I've been there for 14 years. The states are the one taking that lead because they're the more near to the people. But also I understand the regulations that always come from the federal government. How we can improve that kind of relation in terms of leaving the power with the people instead with the regulations from the federal perspective. I mean, how can we make direct recommendations? If each of you got the opportunity to actually design the process, what should be the recommendations you will give?
I'd begin by getting the principle right. The most important thing you can do is get the starting point right. And it seems to me that there are at least two here. So Lincoln in Chicago said, if we know where we are and where we are tending, we will know what to do and how to do it. Two things are intimately true. One is this nation, the U.S. Constitution and the state constitutions are all based on a higher recognition that all men are created equal, that gives rise to consent. Thus, legislators and lawmaking are more powerful than other people telling us what to do. And the American people know that. The second thing, I think, is to observe that over the years, what has happened to how we govern ourselves is that we don't do it anymore. Other people are governing us.
I can tell you by my example. I represent 3.4 million American citizens in Puerto Rico, and I don't have the right to vote.
Having that play out through the legislative process, as opposed to the regulatory process, which at this level, at the state level, and the local level, is becoming more and more Byzantine and complicated and bureaucratic, centralized from Washington, is not the way to go. If you get agreement on those two things, I would argue that a lot of the process would follow very nicely.
Chairman, I know that the time expired, but if I can let that question to be open to our witnesses today to send us to the task force direct recommendations. And I got the history, I got the relations, the way you see the issue. But if this committee can have actual proposals or recommendations for legislation, that will be a great deal of help for the committee. Thank you.
Okay, we're screwed.
Sorry.
No, it's just the time got away from us. The votes were called at 42, so we are roughly 10 minutes into a vote. What I can ask is for everyone else who is here, if you'd be willing to do that, because I realize you're coming down from, when you're down here from Connecticut, I appreciate it. You guys are a little bit closer, but that's beside the point. If we could actually put some questions or some concepts in writing and send them to you, could you give a response to us, or you'd be willing to do that?
Of course.
Sure. Of course.
So for the rest of us that didn't have a chance to say anything yet, if you could, or anyone who did have a chance to say anything yet, if you could get some stuff to Adam, we will, staff, our committee, then we'll send them to you. Because I know I even have some things, when we were talking about Brandeis, you're talking the concept of consultation, if we have to structurally force some kind of compromise. I would love you to actually respond to those type of things if that's possible. And then we'll apologize for having to cut this short. It's going to take, well, I want to see you go down the steps. Actually, if you just get your aide to push you at the top and just give a shove, you can get down there real fast.
Solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. But it's going to take us a while to get down there. But thank you for being here. Your stuff that you wrote to us, and we have, as well as the oral testimony, was fascinating. And it's cool, and there's all sorts of ideas I think are percolating with that. So we may be getting back to you if you can help us out, maybe written. We'll still keep this process going.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we'll come back. Thank you.